Yesterday we had an introduction to the book of Genesis and also an introduction to the Pentateuch. Today I want to talk through the book of Genesis. We won't be taking things verse by verse, but more like story by story or chapter by chapter in some cases. The difficulty is, of course, that there are in Genesis so many things that are not only important but also controversial, even among Christians, that there are questions people have. Today someone was asking me what I think about carbon dating and the fossil ancestors of mankind, and yesterday somebody's asking me about how many people, where were the other people that Cain was concerned about when he left home, and where to get his wife, and things like that. Those kinds of questions have been around for a very long time and need to be discussed. The problem is they take time to discuss, and Christians are not all on the same side of some of those issues, which when I'm teaching through Genesis, and again I would just say that at my website you can listen to all my lectures on Genesis. There's very many of them. I go into all that kind of thing in detail. I don't leave any of that kind of thing out. I'm going to have to take a much quicker swath through the book and not deal with every controversy, but I'm hoping to leave some time at the end for any questions you have about Genesis that remain unanswered after the lectures. Also, you can always approach me at lunchtime or other places with questions that don't get answered here. The first 11 chapters of Genesis, as we pointed out numerous times yesterday, are unique in that they give the history of the world prior to the time of Abraham. Now, as such, that section has to be treated separately, because once you get to the story of Abraham, you're really focused on a single family, on a single plan, and detail is given about the individuals in that story and so forth. And so it's going to be, covering that material will be a little different. It's more biographical and theological even, whereas the first 11 chapters cover a great length of time. In fact, the entire Old Testament covers about 4,000 years, as near as we can determine. About 4,000 years is the Old Testament history. 2,000 of those years are covered in the first 11 chapters. In other words, Abraham's story happens about 2000 BC. If the earth was created about 4000 BC, and of course that's disputed, but that's the numbers we have. If we've got 4,000 years of pre-Christian history, Abraham's life falls right in the middle of those, and that's at chapter 12, chapters 11 and 12 of Genesis. So the first half of all Old Testament history is told us in 11 chapters only. Obviously, it's very selective. 2,000 years is a lot of things went on, and we're not really told many details. But we are told details about a few important things. Of course, the creation is the first thing, and that's, in one respect, the most significant thing, because creation not only tells us where we came from, but gives us an indication that there's reasons for us being here. No one who's intelligent creates complex things without having some function for them in mind. Any machine that's been created, even the simplest machine, was done not just so the inventor could be amused, but so that the machine would function and do something in particular. God created the universe for what purpose? Well, in Isaiah it says he created the world to be inhabited. So life in the universe is not simply an afterthought. It's not something that just arose accidentally because there happened to be a universe with certain conditions suitable for life to arise. By the way, there is not a universe with conditions suitable for life to arise accidentally. The evolutionists believe that there must be, but no one has ever discovered any natural factors in the universe that would suggest that life could arise by itself. So the suggestion that, well, life just arose because there was a universe here where it could happen. As far as we know, there isn't a universe here where it could happen, because it can't happen. No one can explain by any natural processes how life could have arisen without creation, but that's another story. It's not that, well, the universe was here for billions of years and then life just happened to be one of the products of the universe. The universe was created for the purpose of hosting life. God made the heavens and the earth so that they would be inhabited. And inhabited they are. There's at least this part, this world. We don't know of any living life forms, certainly no intelligent life, outside of our solar system or outside of our planet. There are perhaps billions of solar systems out there, maybe billions of them. But up to this point, no one has ever discovered any evidence that life as we know it exists in any of those other solar systems. And if we did find some evidence of some kind of life, it'd be another story to find something like intelligent life. For example, some people think they might find, microscopic organisms on Mars or something like that. That has not been proven to be the case, but if they did, that's a different thing than intelligent life. God could, of course, create microorganisms to do functions in the natural world that have nothing to do with his overall plan for the universe, except that they produce gases or consume gases or do things that have to be done. But we don't even know that this is the case outside of the world. The world is the Earth is the only world we know of that has water and an atmosphere of air, which is with oxygen and carbon dioxide and things that are necessary to sustain life as we know it. Now, conceivably, I suppose, science fiction can tell us there's different kinds of life. There's nothing like life as we know it that don't need those conditions, but that's all speculation. God made the earth and the heavens to be inhabited, and the Bible even says he gave the sun and the moon to give light on the earth. So the presence of the sun was primarily for the benefit of the earth, even though there are other planets that circle the sun, and we're not all entirely clear on why they exist or what their function is. Perhaps they hold perhaps the combined gravitation of the planets combined with that of the sun is something necessary to keep the earth in its proper orbit. I don't really know. I'm not a scientist. But, excuse me, when God created, man wasn't the first thing he created, but it was the thing he had in mind when he created. He created plant life before he created man. He created animal life in the sea and in the air before he created terrestrial life, creatures on land. He made earth creatures, that is to say, land creatures, before he made man. By the time of the end of the first week, as recorded in Genesis chapter 1, God had, before he made man, a world full of plants and animals. And had that been all he wanted, he could have settled it like that. There'd never be sin, there'd never be war, there'd never be pain, there'd never be sorrow, there'd never be a fall. But God took another step. That was the fateful step that brought about the crisis of human history. And that was when God said, let us make man in our own image. Let us give him dominion over the other things that are made. And this meant that man had to have characteristics that none of the other creatures had. You can't give dominion, that is, you can't give responsibility to a cow or to a lion. They don't make free choices. They're not creatures of rational choice. If someone's going to rule, that means they're going to make decisions. They're going to have to think things out. They're going to have to choose between options. And so God made a creature unlike the previous creatures that was more like him, namely rational, capable of making choices, even capable of being creative of new things. Humans they create things. Animals don't create things. Plants don't create things. So God made something more like himself. The decision God made is not very different in a way than the decision a couple may have to have children when they already have pets. There are many animal lovers who prefer having pets to having children. I know a number of couples that don't have any children, but they have pets instead. I chose to have children. I like animals too, but children are much better than animals. At least potentially. They're also potentially much worse than animals. Because human beings can go good or they can go bad. Animals are just what they are. They're neither good nor bad. I mean, a carnivore can give you a lot of grief if it's a wild carnivore and you're in its territory. But that doesn't make it a bad animal. It's just doing what it's made to do. That's how it survives. It may be inconvenient to its prey, but it's not evil. But people can be downright evil. And they can be excellent. They can be good. And this is why many people, even people who love animals, choose, let's have some kids. Why? Because the kids can actually grow up and be like you. They can communicate with you. They can relate with you at a much different level than any animal can, and you can give them responsibility, and you expect them to take responsibility. And not so much in modern times, but throughout most of history, children were raised to take over the family farm or the family business or something like that. They would apprentice under their parents. So they'd be, or if they were women and they weren't in business in those days, they were raised to be mothers to take over the family grandchildren and great-grandchildren, to perpetuate things, to be responsible for carrying on what the parents had started. And that seems to be why God made man. People sometimes have asked me, why did God put that tree in the garden that caused all the trouble? Why did God let the serpent be there in the garden? Why did God set people up for failure like that, so that we'd have all these problems that have become as a result of the fall? First of all, God didn't set us up for failure, but by making human beings who could make choices, he did invent or create the possibility of failure, the possibility of going wrong. But you can't really have such a possibility of going wrong unless there's an equal possibility of going right. You can't have one or the other without the other. If people have free choice, the choice is between a good option and a bad option. Unless all the options are good. And you might say, why didn't God do it that way? Well, it depends on why God even gave free choice. What is life for? What is man for? What did God make us for? What's the whole purpose for God creating things? Once we understand that, and I think many Christians haven't thought it through. Once we understand that, then we have a picture of what we're doing and what's going on in the world and how to make sense of it. I mean, there's many people who say, why is there evil in the world? Why is there suffering in the world? If God is a good God, why does he allow horrible things to happen and so forth? Well, that's a very good question. And to answer it, we have to go back to what God's purpose was in the beginning. He wanted to have some creatures that were more like him in their rationality, in their freedom of choice, so that they could govern, so they could have dominion. His purpose was to make creatures that he could hand it over to, like a man who starts a corporation and builds a big business and wants to hand it over to his children and wants his kids to be competent to take it over. Well, he can't hand it over to his Labrador Retriever. Now, the Labrador Retriever that he had before he had kids will never betray him, will never give him any grief. It'll be loyal, but it'll never take on any responsibility for the family or for the business. You have to have kids, and you take the risk of them bringing you grief when you have kids, because many times that's what children do. They bring their parents grief. But the idea is to have kids not so that they will bring grief, but so that they will have human capacities, which animals don't have, and they can take on responsibilities. God made humans, I believe, because he wanted to have a family. And that's different than a menagerie of animals. He didn't want a zoo or a ranch. He wanted a family. He had a zoo. He had a ranch. He had all the animals already, but he wanted a family as well. But the purpose of having a family was so that he could hand over the dominion of all things that he made to his loyal offspring. Now, loyal is a very important thing. If a man is a brain surgeon and he sets up a practice and it becomes very prestigious and he's a well-known surgery that he has maybe a practice that has even subordinate surgeons working under him, and he wants to leave that to his kids. He wants his kids to become brain surgeons and take over the business when he retires. Well, he wants his kids to be brain surgeons, but he doesn't want them to be unless they're going to be good brain surgeons. They're going to have to learn. They're going to have to go to school. They're going to have to go through tests. That's what happens in school. You learn lessons, then you take tests to see if you learned the lessons. If you don't learn the lessons, you fail the tests, and you don't become a brain surgeon, thankfully. It's great to become a brain surgeon if you're competent and if you've passed the tests and proven yourself to be qualified. But no man wants to hand his surgery over to his son who's an idiot or who's irresponsible or careless or who didn't pass the tests at the medical school. Testing is there to see if you're competent and qualified for what you're being trained for. Adam and Eve were made to be rulers. Now, if you want to give rulership or leadership to somebody, you want to make sure that they're going to be competent and loyal. You don't want to hand the leadership of the company over to someone who's going to betray all your principles and bring reproach on your name. You want to hand it over to people who are like you and competent like you and loyal to your principles and so forth. Adam and Eve were made to govern, to have dominion, but they needed to be tested to see if they would be loyal. It was no mistake that there was a tree in the garden, or even that there was a devil in the garden. You know, God didn't have to let the devil be there. You ever think about that? God didn't have to let there be a devil. Someday the Bible says he's going to throw him in the lake of fire. There won't be a devil anymore. Why didn't he do that a long time ago? Why didn't he do that to the devil before Adam and Eve were even created? Why didn't he put the devil on a different planet? Why did he let him live in the same garden, the very garden where he put his own kids? Because the devil is the tester. He's the tempter. The word tempt means test. And the purpose of the devil, he has a purpose. God wanted there to be a devil. Now, he doesn't want him to be there forever, so he's going to get rid of him someday. But for the time being, there's a purpose that God has in the devil being here, or else he wouldn't let him be here. God's not obligated. He doesn't owe the devil anything. If God didn't want the devil here, get rid of him. The fact that God has allowed the devil to persist this long is because he's not done with him yet. The devil is still of use. It was the Holy Spirit that led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. God wanted Jesus to be tested by the devil. That's why the Holy Spirit led him there to do it. He leads us through various tests as well. The Bible says that God tests the hearts of men. It says that in Proverbs. You know, gold, the refining pot is for silver and the furnace for gold, but the Lord tests the hearts of men. We know that Job was tested. And who did the testing? The devil did. He's the tester. And so God allowed there to be a tester and a test. The tree was the test. And these, Adam and Eve, had the choice. Now, some people say, well, it seems like they were so naive. God just set them up for failure. They didn't know anything, and here they get deceived right off. Well, he didn't set them up for failure. You know, he said, there's a one-question test here, and I'll give you the answer before you take the test. This tree, don't eat it. The question, should you eat it, should you not? That's the test. The answer is no. When you eat it, you'll die. So it's like if you came to a college class the first day, and the professor said, if you want to pass this course, there's going to be one final exam. There's only one question on the exam. I'm telling you what the answer is right now. Now, is that setting people up for failure? That's setting them up for success. God told them the truth, but their loyalty to him was what was being tested. When Eve was told, no, you won't die if you eat that. When the devil said, you know, God knows if you eat it, you'll be like him. He doesn't want any rivals. He doesn't want you to be his rival, but you can be. You can know good and evil like he does. You can be like God. Is that what you like? And Eve apparently said, I guess so. Now, Eve had the choice. She could say, wait a minute. I don't know who you are, but I know this guy, God, he made me, you know. Seems like I'm obligated to do what he said. He said not to do it. I can't figure out who's telling the truth about what, but I'm going to trust him. I'm going to be loyal to him. If she had done that, she would have passed the test. Instead, she failed. Now, every human being ever since is tested the same way. Your whole life is your testing. Why? Because like Adam and Eve, you were created to rule with Christ. The Bible says if we endure, we will reign with him. Jesus said, blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. Jesus is going to rule over all things when he returns, and those who are faithful to him are going to reign with him. Those who come with him are called and chosen and faithful, it says in Revelation chapter 19. And that's what he's looking for. He's looking for loyal, faithful people. The vast majority of people on the earth fail the tests. What are the tests they have? Well, they may be born believing lies from parents who teach them lies, or in a society that teaches them lies. They may go through trauma, which makes them tempted to be angry at God. Now you might say, well, of course they're angry at God. They went through this trauma as a child. They were abused as a child. I know people who were abused as children who aren't angry at God. Amen. I know people who've lost their children and didn't get angry at God. When crisis and trials happen to people, that's the test. When Job's children died, when his cattle was taken from him, when his boils broke out on him, that's the kind of stuff that makes people angry and bitter sometimes. Job didn't go there. He said, blessed be the Lord. You know, the Lord gives and the Lord takes away. That's always a choice we have. That's the choice Adam and Eve had. That's the choice every human has. The purpose of life is, this is school. This is school. You're learning to trust God. You're learning to be loyal to God. You're learning to love God. And the devil's there to test you, to make you think that maybe God shouldn't be loved, shouldn't be trusted. Maybe you shouldn't be loyal to God. And there's 1,000 ways that he tests people, and that's what he's there for. But those who pass the test, Jesus said, be faithful unto death, and I'll give you the crown of life as you'll rule with him. Remember the parables of the talents? He said, you were faithful in little things, you rule over 5 cities. You rule over 10 cities, and so forth. When Jesus comes back, he's going to take those who are faithful through the tests, who pass the tests, and trust them with responsibility. That's what he made Adam and Eve for, but they had to be tested. You don't turn over the family business to an incompetent or unreliable son or daughter. They have to be proven. And that's why God made people. That's why he made a devil. That's why he made a tree in the garden. That's why he made a test. That's why, Adam and Eve's test was a relatively simple one, but they didn't have much sophistication. They were brand new. We are tested more sophisticated. We hear all kinds of arguments against God. We have all kinds of things to give us incentive to not like God. We see hypocrisy in religious people, which might turn you against religion or God. We experience crisis, disappointment, and those are the very things that cause people to say, I don't want anything to do with God. And I say to those people, well, welcome to graduation. You failed. You failed your test. All those things that made you turn against God, those were the tests. Are you going to be loyal or not? Yes?
I have a question. I don't know if it'll come out right, but I guess there's some people who say the Lord doesn't test us or tempt us. But in this case, is it more so that he allows the testing to happen from the enemy? Or
in many cases, that's how it is. When the trials are coming, the book of Job would suggest it's not so much that God sends our hardships, not directly, but the devil wants to do it, and God gives him permission, or not. Now, by the way, the book of Job makes it very clear that God often doesn't give the devil permission, and that's encouraging to know, because the devil complained to God about Job. He says, I can't touch him. You put a hedge around him and all his stuff. I can't lay a hand on him. But give me permission, and then I can do this, and then he'll curse you. This is what God said. That's what the devil said to God. And no doubt that's got some kind of parallel in our own temptations, that the devil, intending to test us, hoping to ruin us, actually, has to come before God to get permission. Otherwise, there's a hedge around us that he can't get through. This is important to know. Right now, I don't know if you're going through any major trials, but you will someday. And you probably have in the past. At the moment, I'm assuming you're relatively comfortable. None of us are starving. We're not exposed to elements that are going to kill us in the next 24 hours. We're not in danger, as far as we know. And, it's like at the moment, the devil doesn't seem to have permission. He might 5 minutes from now, but at the moment, things are pretty good for most of us. And we could say, probably they're pretty good for most of us most of the time. But there are those times, life is punctuated by those times where things are not good for us. Horrible things happen. We lose loved ones. We lose our health. We have a terrible accident. We're thrown in prison. We're tortured. Things like that happen to Christians and to people in general. When that happens, we have to assume that this is because God has removed the hedge at that moment. And he only did it for a purpose. The same purpose he removed the hedge from Job. It's a test. It's time for you to go through another test. It's examination time. And the devil is the examiner. And you are the student. And life is school. And when we get to the end of life, if we've died faithful, we have passed the course. Then what? Then Jesus comes and we enter into an eternal career of reigning with him. That's the purpose of life. That's why God made people and didn't just leave it with animals. Sure, it's a horrible risk to make people, but apparently you can't have what God was looking for without that risk being attached. Just like you can't have children without the risk of some of them giving you grief someday. And yet, if you don't have children, you're not going to have any kids. Not going to have any grown kids. Not going to have a family. Unless, I mean, you can adopt them, but even adopt them takes the same risk. The point is, when you bring humans into your life, you bring the potential for grief, especially if you love them. I've known people who say, I'm never going to love anyone again because I was in love and this person broke my heart. I think, well, that happens, you know, people do disappoint you. But you can't just decide I'm never going to get close to anybody again. You can't become a hermit and please God. You're going to have to just tough it up and say, okay, it's, you know, I take a risk. When I'm in a relationship, I'm taking a risk. And that's what God did. He took a risk. Now, when I say took a risk, I'm not saying he didn't know how it would turn out. We don't. When we take risks, we don't know how it's going to turn out. When we throw dice, we don't know what numbers are going to come up. God knew. I believe God knew. But nonetheless, he did it because the result he wanted, in fact, the result he knew he was going to get was, on balance, desirable. Even if there's many people who are lost who fail the test, he doesn't want any to fail the test. He's not willing that any should perish, but that all should come to repentance. But some, he gave them the choice. If they fail the test, that's sadly, it's on them. But God knew there'd be many who would not fail the test. There'd be many who would bring great joy to him, and that he would eternally enjoy as faithful sons and daughters to whom he can share his dominion over the universe. Now that's the purpose of the creation. And we even see it in Genesis chapter 1, because he says, let us make man in our own image and let us give them dominion. That's the purpose. At the end of the book, in Revelation, it says, we shall reign on the earth. It says that in Revelation 5:10, you know, he has made us kings and priests, or a kingdom of priests, and we shall reign on the earth. That's the purpose. He made the earth to be inhabited and reigned over by people who are faithful and loyal to him. But at the present time, it's a battlefield. It's a schooling time. It's a place where we're being tested to see if we'll reign over the earth someday. And many will, and many will not. Now, in making Adam and Eve, the Bible indicates that we have a type and a shadow here, in Adam and in Eve. In Adam, we have a type of Christ. We know this from what it says in Romans chapter 5, I think it's verse 14, that says that Adam was a type of him who was to come. And I mentioned yesterday that simply that Adam was the founder of a humanity, the first of a human race. Jesus is the first of another human race, of a reborn human race, born as children of God. And therefore, a different kind, of different nature. Adam's race is fallen and sinful. Christ's race are born again with a new spirit and a new heart, and are inclined to follow God. But not without challenges, because we have a flesh also that is the means by which the devil tests us. Eve was tested in the flesh. When she was told that the fruit would be good for her, it says in chapter 3, verse 6, that Eve saw that the fruit was good for food and pleasant to the eyes and desirous to make one wise. So it was appealing to her flesh. It's, hey, this is good for food. It's attractive. I'd like that. You know, a little bauble, you know, so I take some of that home, put it on the centerpiece on my dining room table because it's attractive. And I'm told that it'll make me wise if I eat it. So, I mean, there's all these things are appealing to something in her, which we call the flesh. We still have flesh, and therefore that's how the devil appeals to us, is through the flesh. Sometimes the flesh is stupid enough to go that way. But our hearts, if we're born again, are toward God. And therefore, Paul says in Galatians 5:17, the flesh lusts against the spirit and the spirit against the flesh, and these two are contrary to one another, so that we don't really always do what we want to do. But our trajectory is toward God. We fall, we stumble, but we get back up again and follow God, because that's where our heart is. That's the new race in the new Adam, Christ. Now, Adam's wife also is, in a sense, a type, Because when God made Adam and Eve, it says in Genesis 2:24, for this cause a man will leave his father and mother and cling to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. That's the basic definition of marriage, quoted by Jesus in Matthew 19 and quoted by Paul in Ephesians 5. Both Jesus and Paul quote that verse when they're defining marriage. And so they were the first married couple, and they were the prototype for marriage. Now, when Paul quotes that verse in Ephesians 5, he quotes, for this cause shall a man leave his father and mother and so forth, cleave to his wife, and they be one flesh. He's quoting this in Ephesians 5:31 through 32. He finishes by saying, this is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Now, Christ, remember, Adam's a type of Christ. What is Eve a type of? The bride of Adam, the bride of Christ, the church. Eve is a picture of the church, a type. So we have Christ and the church depicted right there in the very beginning when God makes Adam and Eve. Now I should explain something that people are confused about. You read in Genesis chapter 1, the first 6 days of creation, and basically it's an overview, starting with nothing, ending up with man and woman. It just mentioned them together in Genesis 1:27. God made man in his own image, male and female, he created them. Doesn't talk about some separate act of creating a woman or anything like that. Just mentions he made male and female. And then the first 3 verses of chapter 2 talk about the 7th day, which ends that series, and God rested on that day and didn't do anything else, and that became the basis for Jewish Sabbath keeping. But then in chapter 2, verse 4, and through that chapter you get another story of creation. And it's got different details. It specifies that God made man from the dust of the earth. That's not specified in chapter 1, that they are made from the dust of the earth, but it says he made man, and then man named the animals, and then God made the woman from the man's rib, and then you had the man and woman. Now Genesis chapter 1, where it's just going through the 6 days, it just mentions God made man, male and female. He doesn't give any breakdown. What we have in chapter 2, beginning of verse 4, is a second account that is what we might call a sidebar. Now, those of you who don't speak English as a first language, I don't know if you have the word in your language, sidebar. Many English-speaking people might not know what it is, but if you're reading a news magazine and it's about something going on, in Iraq or something like that, there might be sort of a block of text at the side that goes into detail on something that is only mentioned in passing in the article. The article is kind of given a longer view of things, but there's something mentioned in there that they want to give you more information on, so they put a sidebar in, and they have more detail about that one thing that was rather lightly passed over in the main article. That's what Genesis 2:4 and following is, in my opinion. God has passed over very lightly and quickly in chapter 1 the creation of man and woman. He hasn't gone into detail for the simple reason that the first account is an overview. It runs through a chronological sequence, first day, second day, third day, and so to the 7th day. It has that structural purpose. And the mention of Adam and Eve being created, or man and woman, is mentioned only a little bit more in detail than the mention of animals being created, or plants. And in each case it ends up, God says it's good, it's good, it's good. And it says that about man and woman too. You've got this structure of the first account going through the first 7 days. It's an overview of the whole week. But lest we should get the idea that the creation of humans was no more significant than the creation of animals and plants and things like that, there's a sidebar or an additional amplification of the events of the later part of the 6th day when God made male and female. And it tells us that God, made the man first, and then he made the woman to be a partner to the man. And then it tells us how he gave them instructions about not eating of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and that they would die if they ate it. Now, chapter 3 then tells us about how they violated that command. Chapter 3 is about the temptation and the sin of Eve and of Adam. It does appear that Satan's conversation is primarily with Eve, but it does say she took the fruit and ate it and gave it to her husband with her, and he ate it, so they both fell. It's interesting. Some people say, well, what? Leave it to the narratives of the old cultures to blame the woman. Actually, it doesn't blame the woman. It's true she ate first, but the Bible always blames Adam. The New Testament says it's Adam through whom sin came. It's Adam through whom death came. The New Testament mentions the woman, but the blame is put on Adam. Why? Because Adam was supposed to be in charge. The woman was made to be his helper. And he wasn't supposed to let her lead him down the path to destruction. He was supposed to be there to protect her, no doubt, and to keep her from going wrong. He didn't. He failed her. And he failed himself. And he failed us all because they both sinned, and the responsibility falls essentially on him. The buck stopped with him, and so he can't pass the buck. He tried to. When God confronted him about it, he said, well, the woman you gave me, she's the one who gave me the fruit, and I ate it. So it's her fault, or is it even God's fault? You gave me her. I didn't ask for her. Well, you can blame everybody but yourself. This is the first time the blame game really is seen, and yet humans have not stopped doing it. We always want to, when we're found guilty of something, we want to be self-justified. This is what blaming others is about. Humans who are guilty have a craving to be justified, which is, of course, what the gospel presents, justification with God. But justification means I want to be seen as righteous. I don't want to be seen as guilty. I don't know why. Why should we care if we're seen as guilty? It's human nature. I don't want to take the blame. I don't want to be seen as at fault. Therefore, I want to find somebody else to heap the fault on. The woman herself blamed the devil. She said, the devil made me do it. Man said, the woman you gave it to me. No one's taking personal responsibility here. And it's not natural for people to take human responsibility. It's humbling. But why is it humbling? Why should we even care about that? Except that we were made with an instinct for justice and rightness. And we recognize when we've done wrong. Adam and Eve, before they did wrong, were naked, but they weren't ashamed. Nakedness suggests being basically totally full exposure here. No secrets. Got nothing to be ashamed of here. But as soon as they sinned, it says their eyes were open. They knew they were naked. They covered themselves. They felt shame. They felt something's not right with me. I don't want people to see what's not right with me. Being naked here makes me feel too exposed. And that's kind of, it literally happened, I think, but I think it's symbolic too of our attempts when we realize we've done something wrong to find excuses, to find a way to cover that, to not be exposed, to hide it, to not be naked. It says in Hebrews chapter 12 that all things are naked and open before God with whom we have to do. Nakedness suggests being visible to all. And it's interesting how human nature just instinctively reacts to the sense of guilt. I've done something wrong. I don't want anyone to know. I don't want people to see me for who I am. I want to find someone else to blame. All this is going on right at the very first time sin showed up, and it's still our tendency whenever there's sin in our lives now. We have to resist that. It says in Proverbs, he that covers his sin shall not prosper, but whosoever confesses and forsakes them shall find mercy. But Adam and Eve started out by covering. And then when God confronted them about it, they even didn't fess up fully. They admitted that they did it, but they basically said, someone else is really more at fault than I am in this deal. A sense of self-justification. And that's what people do. That's what religion is for. That's what religions are invented for, to find a way to be justified. I want to be better. I want to think I'm a good person. What is required to be seen as a good person in the eyes of whatever deities may be? In pagan religions, animal sacrifices became a way of trying to appease the deities so that they don't punish for guilt. They don't send earthquakes, and they don't send volcanoes, and they don't send tsunamis because we've placated them with these sacrifices. But where did people get the idea of offering sacrifices? Where's that? That's kind of a universal thing in the religions of the world, no matter what continent you go to. People with their pagan religions have sacrifices. Where did they get the idea that that's the thing to do? Well, one thing we see is that when Adam and Eve sinned, God, finding that they had inadequately covered themselves with fig leaves, you can imagine how a suit of fig leaves would hold up in real life activities, or any kind of leaves. God gave them animal skins I'm assuming it was sheepskins, to cover themselves. We might think of buckskin or something like that, but probably he sacrificed sheep, and the skins were given to cover their nakedness. This was the first time animals were sacrificed to cover man's sin or woman's sin. And so they were covered by God's own initiating a sacrifice, and people forever afterward have had this instinct: animals must be sacrificed in order to cover sin. When the first two children of Adam and Eve were born, and when they grew up, and when they took on religious responsibility, they began to offer sacrifices. Now, Abel offered a sheep because he was a shepherd. It was an easy thing for him to do. And Cain, who was a farmer of plants, offered some kind of a vegetable sacrifice. God was not satisfied with Cain's offering. Cain realized that and got angry and jealous and killed his brother. Now, some people say, well, what was wrong with Cain's offering? Well, there's different theories. One is that God was holding out for a blood sacrifice, because the blood sacrifices in the Old Testament are types and shadows of Christ. We could say that the sheep that Abel offered, and even the sheep or the animals that God killed to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness, are types of Christ, because ultimately the reason God chose animal sacrifices as the Old Testament type is because they foreshadow Christ's ultimate sacrifice. It's his blood that covers sins. Without the shedding of blood, there's no remission of sins. And therefore, every sacrifice in the Old Testament, whether it's offered by God in the Garden of Eden, or whether it's offered by Abel or Noah or Abraham or the Jews, it's always a type of Christ. What's interesting, though, is that even people who weren't Jews, people who weren't godly, even Cain intuitively knew he had to offer a sacrifice. He just didn't do it God's way. And so he committed the first murder, and he was banished. We know that he was told that he had to be driven from society. And he said, well, if anyone finds me, they'll kill me. And God says, well, I'll put a mark on you, and if anyone finds you, they are not allowed to kill you. They can see this mark, and I'm going to put the word out. Anyone who kills you will be avenged sevenfold. Well, Cain went off and started a town, a village, and named it after his first son. He had a wife and so forth. Now, the questions that come to people's minds as they read up to this point in Genesis say, who was he afraid of? Who is his wife? We read in Genesis chapter 3 the sin of Adam and Eve, and they're driven from the garden. And then in chapter 4 we read about Cain is born, and then Abel's born. The next thing we know, Cain's killing Abel. And then we've got, him running off and having a family somewhere. Where'd the family come from? Where'd these people come from? Now, you have to understand, the Bible is not telling every detail. It's covering thousands of years in a couple of chapters. Cain and Abel weren't simply born and then Cain killed Abel. They grew up. They grew up. They were adults before this happened. Obviously, he didn't marry a woman who was 5 years old or 2 years old. He was an adult man. Well, what were Adam and Eve doing all this time? Well, what did God tell them to do? Anyone remember what God told them? They didn't have a real hard assignment. Be fruitful and multiply. Have a lot of kids. Isn't that cool? Your whole assignment in life is just have sex. Be fruitful, multiply, have kids. So we have to assume they didn't have birth control, and they weren't being rebellious on this particular point.
All the kids.
And they lived to be 900 and something years old. Think of how many kids they can have. Now, in Genesis 5, it specifically says that they did have sons and daughters. In addition to the children who are named, and there's only 3 of the children of Adam and Eve that are actually named in stories, because those children are significant enough to tell their stories. But apart from the ones that are named, it says in Genesis 5:4 that he begot Seth, Adam did, and the days of Adam were 800 years, and he had sons and daughters. Now, sons and daughters means besides the ones that we've paused to say anything about. How many sons and daughters? There could have been hundreds of them. Who knows? I assume that if God made one couple to populate the earth, he probably made them very fertile. There are women in modern times who've had 24 children. And they didn't live to be 900 years old. Now, how long did Cain and Abel live before before Cain killed Abel, and then expressed these concerns about other people, finding him or his need to take a wife, whatever. How long did they live before this happened? About 130 years. Why do I say that? Well, if you look at Genesis 4, you'll see that after Cain killed Abel, verse 25, Adam and Eve went at it again, and they had a son named Seth. And notice Eve said, when Seth was born, God has appointed another offspring for me instead of Abel, whom Cain killed. Now, we have to assume this comment suggests that Cain had recently killed Abel, and Seth was the first son born after that. So she saw him as a new son to replace Abel, who had probably recently been killed. He's not the third child they had, but he's the first son they had after Cain killed Abel. That's fair enough to infer from what she says. God has given me this one to replace Abel, whom Cain slew. So whenever Cain killed Abel, the next son born was Seth. Well, look at chapter 5. It says in verse 3, Adam lived 130 years and begot Seth. And just put it together. How old were Adam and Eve when Seth was born? 130 years old. If Seth was the first son born to them after the death of Abel, then Cain and Abel had been born like 128, 129 years previously. That means when Cain killed Abel, they were over a century old. There'd be a lot of people on the earth at that time. They could not only have brothers and sisters, but Adam and Eve could have grandchildren and great-grandchildren in a century's time. So there could be hundreds and hundreds of people on the earth at the time. The Bible simply doesn't name all of them. The Bible's story is a sketch. It only gives details about select instances of importance. Chapter 5 goes through the genealogy from Seth, whose birth was mentioned last in chapter 4, his genealogy through up to the time of Noah. So you got 10 generations in chapter 5, covering from Seth to Noah. Now, Noah had 3 sons, Ham, Shem, and Japheth. And he was uniquely righteous in the earth. The world had gotten worse and worse. Cain killing Abel was just the beginning of violent crimes. And it says in Genesis 6 that violent crime filled the earth in the days of Noah. That the thoughts and intents of men's hearts were only evil continually, and the earth was filled with violence. Something that is said to contribute to that is that the sons of God, this is the beginning of Genesis 6, saw the daughters of men that they were beautiful to look upon and took wives of them, as many as they chose. And it says there were Nephilim, the Hebrew word Nephilim, usually translated giants. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also afterward. When the sons of God went into the daughters of men and children born to them, the same became mighty men of the earth, men of renown. And the earth is then seen to be full of violence and evil. So the sons of God marrying the daughters of men seems to be a factor that led to the increased corruption of the world, leading to the flood. Now there's a number of theories, but 2 primary theories about these sons of God. One that's most popular today, and it comes actually from the book of Enoch, which is not an inspired book. The book of Enoch was written a couple hundred years before Christ by someone claiming to be Enoch who was not. But it was a very influential and popular religious book in the time of Jesus and the apostles. Even Jude quotes from the book of Enoch in his epistle. But in the book of Enoch it says these sons of God actually refers to angels or watchers who came down from heaven because they were attracted to human women, and they had sex with them, had kids, and their kids were sort of these half-breed demon/humans. And that's what the Nephilim were. They say the Nephilim were their offspring, and the presence of these demon-human hybrids is what led to the corruption of the world that caused the flood. There's a very common view now. The Jews adopted this view from the book of Enoch, and Christians have. Even some of the early fathers adopted this view. But it's not what the Bible teaches specifically. It's just an interpretation. Another interpretation is that the sons of God is a term that's used to speak of godly people. This is, after all, a very normal way of speaking of godly people, both in the Old Testament and the New Testament. In the New Testament, it says, beloved, now we are the children of God. And it does not, we are the sons of God. It does not yet appear what we shall be, but we know that when he shall appear, we'll be like him. In 1 John 3, in John chapter 1, in verse 12, it says, to as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become the sons of God. In the Old Testament, Hosea, God spoke of Israel when they were faithful as being my sons, your sons of the living God. So godly people in the Old and New Testament are also called sons of God. I'm not saying they're the only ones who are, because in Job it would appear that angels are called sons of God. So you really have kind of an ambiguous term here. Is it talking about angels or is it talking about people? Now, if it's talking about people, it's talking about godly people. And the daughters of men that they married were not godly women. I mean, that's the point. These guys were godly. They're called sons of God. The women they married are not called daughters of God. And it says specifically they married them because they found them beautiful. In other words, they did not marry them for their character. They didn't marry them because of, similar religious tastes or interest in God. They were attracted to women strictly on a surface basis and married them on that basis. Now, what you have then would be a godly line of people, probably from Seth onward, who is apparently godly. We know that Enoch was from that line. He was a godly man in chapter 5. And Noah was from that line. This is a line that's historically perhaps godly. Maybe they're the sons of God, or just whoever's godly is the sons of God. But godly people usually pick mates on the basis of spiritual affinity. A godly man wants to marry a godly woman. But in Genesis 6, the godly men began to marry women not because they were godly, but because they were beautiful. Now, many times beautiful women are not godly. Some of them are, some are not. But if you're picking your spouse merely by the way she looks, you're not necessarily going to be getting a godly woman, in every case. Now, when you begin to have a breakdown of the godly families because godly men are no longer marrying godly women, the children are raised in mixed faith homes, and usually when that happens, children choose the path of least resistance or the path of most fun, which is going to be the ungodly parents' way. And so this could have broken down the morals of society over a period of generations when the godly people stopped marrying godly people, but they started marrying people for other reasons, and then what was once perhaps a consistently godly line begins to deteriorate into a compromised line. And therefore there's no more salt in the earth, there's no more light in the world, there's no more the salt has lost its savor, and the righteous have compromised. And then, of course, their children become more compromised, and so the world becomes wicked. Both ways can be seen. There may be more people today who believe that the sons of God are angels who fell and mated with women than there are who hold the other view, but both views are widely held by evangelical conservative Christians. I tend toward the second view for the simple reason that I don't know how angels would have sex with women. For one thing, angels are spirits. Sure, they can materialize in the will of God, but that doesn't mean that they materialize having human DNA. Human DNA is necessary for reproduction with human women. Even an animal that's close in our DNA, chimpanzees have 97% similar DNA, but they can't mate with humans. You have to have 100% human DNA. Now, DNA is a very complicated thing, and it's got a history. It's a code that's passed down from your ancestors, and for an angel to take on a human form is one thing. For it to be human down to the cellular level, where it even has human DNA, that almost, you get that from human ancestry. You have to be, I don't see how angels could mate and have children with people. Besides, it says they married these women. Jesus said the angels don't marry and are not given in marriage. That's one way angels are different than we are. So my guess is it's not angels. If it is, I don't care. The main thing is, some people care a lot about this. But the main thing is that the so-called giants, the Nephilim, by the way, the word Nephilim is found only 2 places in Hebrew literature. Once is there in Genesis 6. The other is in Numbers 13, when the spies go into the land of Canaan and come back and say, we saw Nephilim there. So there were Nephilim after the flood, too, in Canaan. Did angels come down again? I mean, did the angels produce the Nephilim? Angels mating with women? I don't think so. In fact, even in Genesis 6, it does not say that the Nephilim were the offspring of these marriages. The way it's actually worded in the Hebrew is this. there were Nephilim in the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men and children were born to them. So there were Nephilim before and after those marriages. It does not say the Nephilim were produced by those marriages. They were on the earth at the same time. Now, what are Nephilim? Apparently giants. I mean, they're giant people. Not Jack and the Beanstalk type giants. Not like towering high. More like Goliath type giants. Goliath came from a family of giants. There were other giants in his family. His dad and his 4 brothers. But this is the way things were before the flood. The world became corrupt. God sent the flood. Now, there's controversy among Christians as to whether the flood covered the whole earth or not. Some feel that a global flood is just too difficult to believe. For one thing, the amount of water necessary to cover the mountaintops, to cover Mount Everest and so forth, you're going to have a lot more water available than we can find either in the oceans today and the lakes, or even if you would condense all the vapor in the atmosphere, it isn't enough to cover the mountains. And also the way animals are distributed and so forth, and so it's hard to believe, at least some people find it hard to believe, that all the animals in the world were wiped out except those on the ark, and then from there they all traveled, all the marsupials went to Australia, and different kinds of animals went to different places. And so there's people who say, you don't really need a global flood here, because essentially all the people of the earth at the time were probably in the Tigris-Euphrates Valley, whereas the first civilizations, the Sumerians and the Mesopotamian people, were perhaps the only people on earth. God could just flood that valley and kill everybody. He didn't have to flood the whole earth. And so many have argued that the flood was not global. I believe it was global. There's a number of reasons. One is the language of the scripture. It says the highest mountains were covered with water. Furthermore, if it wasn't global, why even build an ark? Why not just get out of the valley? Why spend 120 years building an ark when you could just pack up the stuff and move over the next mountain? There was nowhere to go. Furthermore, the earth was covered for a year with the flood. And then it drained off or evaporated very gradually. It took weeks and weeks for it to come down where the ark could even rest on a mountaintop. Now, a local flood, how would you contain a local flood that was higher than all the mountains? Is there going to be some like invisible wall that keeps it from going over the mountains? If the water's higher than the mountains, it's not going to stay contained. Furthermore, if it is a local flood, when the rain stops, it'll drain off somewhat more quickly. It only rained for 40 days and 40 nights, and it took a year to drain off the water. Why? There's nowhere to go. The whole world was covered. If the world wasn't, a valley would quickly drain off. At least within a few days or weeks. The fact that the water had to evaporate is the reason why it took so long. But where'd all the water go? Why isn't it here now? Well, the Bible says that when the flood came, it says the windows of heaven were open, which is a figure of the rain coming down from the sky. It says, and the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Apparently the aquifers, the underground water was released to supplement it. Perhaps after the flood, that's where it went again. And so it's not visible to us now. It's hard to say. Also, you would not need as much water to cover the earth then as you would now, probably, because mountains, no doubt, have changed in size. Because the earth was covered with water. Supersaturation of the ground makes it very muddy and makes it very changeable. And there were probably movement of tectonic plates and stuff bumping. Probably mountains were formed and mountains were moved and things. When you got the whole water submerged, the whole earth submerged for a year, all kinds of topographical changes can occur. And if you simply had ocean valleys that were not as deep and mountains that were not as tall, you'd need much less water. Even perhaps the water that's available today in the ocean would be enough to cover the earth if a lot of it's in deep ocean valleys. What if those valleys weren't very deep before? That would force the water up over the land. If the mountains weren't very high, it wouldn't really require as much water. We don't know. I'm not arguing that we know. I'm saying we don't know, but there's every reason to believe that the topography was different before the flood, that things changed in that course of time. Yes.
Yeah, and doesn't it also say that it didn't rain before the flood?
It doesn't say it, but what it does do is it indicates that before the flood there was a season where it didn't rain. Whether that season continued till the flood is not made specific. It's in Genesis 2, verses 4 and 5 and 6 that talk about there was not rain on the earth at that time. Of course, the flood was maybe 1,500 years later. It might have begun to rain since or not. Some Christians believe there was, instead of rain, a canopy of water on the outer edge of the atmosphere. And that would have certain effects that we can't go into right now. But that instead of water coming from the sky from clouds originally, water would come up from the earth as a mist, as it says in Genesis. Whether that condition prevailed until the flood, we're not specifically told, but it could be. It could be that it didn't rain before the flood. We know there were no rainbows before the flood. And what causes rainbows but rain, So the rainbow seems to have been seen for the first time after the flood, and God said that's a sign that I won't do this anymore. If there were no rainbows before the flood, there's a pretty good indication that there was no rain before the flood, because rain makes rainbows. So anyway, we have the flood then. Now, I'm going to give you a break, but let me get to the end of chapter 11 if I can. The flood is in chapters 6, 7, and 8. In chapter 8, at the end, Noah and his family come out of the ark. In chapter 9, God gives them some new instructions. First of all, when he made Adam and Eve, he told them to eat plants. When they came out of the ark, he told them to eat animals too. Why? We aren't told. They were told not to eat blood, and this continued to be a requirement under the law later on with Moses also, not to eat blood. But God told them in Genesis 9, don't eat the blood, drain it out, but then you can eat meat as well as plants. He also made a law that anyone who kills human beings must be put to death. That is made in the early part of chapter 9. Now, that law didn't exist when Cain killed Abel, or else Cain would have had to be put to death. God hadn't given that law yet. Cain killed Abel. Under a later system, he would have had to be executed for it, but instead he was just punished and banished. But after the flood, apparently because the earth had become so full of violence, one act of violence that was not going to be tolerated at all was murder. And anyone who kills man by man, his blood shall be shed, it says. So we have the institution of capital punishment and of humans eating meat for the first time after the flood. We have Noah offering sacrifices. Then he also planted a vineyard, and that got him into trouble. He had been a shipbuilder before, hadn't been a vineyard keeper, and we're not even sure if he had drunk wine before that, though he was quite an old man, about 600 years old at the time of the flood. But I'm not sure whether wine was in production before the flood. We don't know. But he found out what wine can do if you drink too much. He got stumbling drunk, and he passed out. And he was in the privacy of his own tent on his bed. But one of his three sons, Ham, just happened into the tent and saw his father drunk on the bed, and his father happened to be naked and unaware of that. Now, his son, Ham, could have done something quite civil, like thrown some clothes over him, throw a blanket over him or something like that, because his father was in an undignified state, and if anyone else had walked in there and found him in that state, he knew his dad would have preferred that no one would see him like that. So Ham could have helped out. He didn't. Instead, he went out and gossiped about it. He told his other two brothers, hey, you should see Dad there. He's drunk and naked. Well, the other two brothers didn't think that was amusing. They put a cloak over their shoulders and walked backward into Noah's tent, so they didn't look at him. They threw the cloak down on his bed where he was and walked out. In other words, they honored him, even though he was in a dishonorable state. The Bible does later give a command, honor your father and your mother. And Ham didn't do that. Just like some people don't honor their parents when they, like celebrities who write, or kids of celebrities who write tell-all books about the life of their parents and tell all the scandals and stuff in their parents' lives. They're uncovering the nakedness of their parents. You know, when parents have kids, they're bringing witnesses into their life, and therefore a vulnerability to exposure that they don't have if they don't have kids. You live alone, you can have all kinds of vices that no one will find out about. You bring kids into your life and they live with you for 19 years, 20 years. They're going to know a lot about you and they can tell the world, but they're not supposed to. Ham was the type who exposed his father's shameful behavior. The other sons were unwilling to do that. So not Ham, but his son Canaan, a curse was uttered on Canaan at the end of chapter 9 by Noah. And I won't go into that in detail, but basically Canaan was Ham's son who gave rise to the Canaanites, who later were destroyed by the Israelites, or commanded to be. They were under God's curse. Interestingly, Moses was writing Genesis for the Jews who were commanded to go into Canaan and conquer the Canaanites. And so he records the fact that this curse was on them. Now when you come to chapter 10, we basically have it's called the Table of Nations. That's because all the ancient nations, all the nations of the ancient world, their origins are recorded there. And they all came from the three sons of Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. There's a long list of nations. Some of these nations don't exist anymore, but all the ancient nations, Babylon, Assyria, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia, the surrounding nations around Israel, and elsewhere in Europe, they are mentioned as coming from Ham, Shem, or Japheth. Now, Ham, it would appear, must have moved south from the Middle East because his descendants were in Africa. The Egyptians, the Libyans, the Ethiopians, and other African nations are said to have been descended from Ham. Now, that doesn't mean Ham was black. Actually, the Canaanites also came from Ham, and they were Middle Eastern, not African. And there's no reason to believe they were black. But the African nations, of course, are largely the indigenous peoples there are black. And this raises the question, where did the colors of the races come from? Why are there brown people and red people and black people and yellow people, so to speak? It's probably politically incorrect to speak of those colors anymore, but when we were children, we read red and yellow, black and white, they are precious in his sight. I guess we're not supposed to talk about color anymore, but let's not worry about political correctness. There are different skin colors and different ethnic traits that different groups have. How could they all come from one family? Well, the answer is, how could all the different colors and sizes and shapes of dogs have come from one species, one pair originally? Because certain animals, and humans are among them, have a gene pool that is diverse. You'll sometimes find parents who are brown-eyed and black-haired have a blue-eyed blonde child. Well, where'd that come from? That was in their gene pool. It was a recessive gene. It didn't show up in their own characteristics, but it showed up in their offspring's characteristics. All the human traits of all the races, if we could call them races, there's really only one human race, but of all the ethnic groups, all the traits can be found in a single gene pool of a single couple. There are examples in modern times. If a person has a black parent and a white parent, they've been called mulatto. And if you take two mulattoes, there's quite a rich gene pool there. They've got from the black, from the white, they've got a lot of genes that can express themselves in offspring. And two mulattoes who marry and have children, it has been found they can have 9 children, of which there are 9 different colors, from pure white to pure black and everything in between. One couple can, if their gene pool is sufficiently rich. Now, one reason that most Norwegians don't have any black kids is because the white genes have been, over the centuries, become dominant in that part of the world. In Africa and many other places where black-skinned people are, the genes for blackness have become isolated. And basically, whatever genes their ancestors may have had for white or other colored children, they've just been bred out of that region. You see, the darker skin that you have, the more melanin you have in your skin, the more resistant you are to the sun's damaging light and rays. Right? Yeah. And in the extreme case, an albino who has no melanin in their skin can't even go out in the sun safely. It's dangerous. Now, there are regions of the world where the sun is intense, and there are regions where it's not as intense. In those equatorial regions where the sun is most intense is where you usually find the darker skinned people. Not because the sun made them dark. That doesn't work. Just try it. go out and get a suntan and see if your kids come out tan. No, they don't. They don't. No, but because people who had more melanin in their skin were able to survive and thrive in those regions more healthily and more successfully than people who didn't have enough melanin in their skin. So those whiter people tended to move to the extremes, especially to the north. We find that Ham's children moved to the south into Africa. Shem's children seem to have been largely in the Middle East and you know, some people say, like today's modern Asian people say that they're descended from Shem, though actually those races are not specified, but they could be from Shem. And then Japheth gave rise largely to the northern and Western European peoples. That's what the Table of Nations tells us in chapter 10. And what I assume is that because people are historically attracted to others who look a lot like them, I know that opposites attract too. And frankly, interracial marriage is very popular today. But throughout most of history, not so much. People were suspicious of people who are not like them. And even people of the same skin color often are attracted to people who are more like them, who have some of the traits. Frankly, you grow up looking at yourself and thinking that's what's attractive. So you see someone else who has those traits, and you think, oh, that's an attractive person. You know, you're drawn in many cases, there are exceptions, but in many cases probably the default tendency is for people to seek mates who are not very different from them, which means that those traits become established, the genes that express those traits become established in their family line over time, if this goes on and on. And so if darker skinned people tended to move to the equatorial zones where they thrived more, and the lighter people moved to the northern parts of Europe and so forth, where they could survive because there wasn't such intense heat and sun, then eventually, by simply intermarrying in their groups, those colorations will become established over decades or centuries or generations or whatever. And this is probably where all the different, we would say, races of men came from. The only way to argue differently would be to argue that human beings of different colors evolved independently in different places, and no one believes that. Because human beings all have the same human DNA, they have to be related to each other. So the point here is, whether you believe in the Bible or you don't believe in the Bible, you still have to have all the races of people came from an original small population. And that small population was Noah and his 3 sons and their wives. So that's where things came from, and the Table of Nations tells us about that. Now finally, chapter 11. Chapter 11 tells us the story of the Tower of Babel. After, of course, Noah's family all spoke the same language, their children spoke the same language, their grandchildren all spoke the same language. But God told them to spread out and fill the earth, gave them the same command he gave to Adam and Eve, be fruitful, multiply, and fill the earth. But in Genesis 11, it says the people began to not want to do that. They wanted to build a tower to unify them in what we would have to recognize as a one-world religion and one-world government. The tower would be a temple, probably to the stars. Most believe it was a ziggurat, which is a kind of temple found in Mesopotamia today that was sort of an astrological observatory. These were people becoming paganized, and they wanted to start a pagan religion to the stars, and they built it as a ziggurat or a temple, a tower, and this was to unite them, because a man named Nimrod, who was the head of this project, wanted to be the world ruler. Now, without the technology that we have today, you can't rule people who aren't very near to you. If people live, thousands of miles from you, you can't have any impact on their life. Or even 100, or even probably 20 miles from you. What are you going to do? That's a long ways to go on a horse. I mean, you can't control people unless they're in one place. So the first city that was built, it wasn't the first city because Cain had built a city, but the first city after the flood that was built was actually Babel, which is where Babylon began. In fact, in the Greek text of the Old Testament, the Septuagint, it's called the Tower of Babylon. And of course, Babylon became the great enemy of God's people in later history, and even is representative of God's enemies in the book of Revelation, even though it's not literal Babylon there. Babylon becomes almost the code word for the evil society. And the Tower of Babel was built in rebellion. God wanted people to spread out over the world so that there couldn't be one person controlling everybody, but Nimrod says, no, let's build a tower so we don't, it says, so we don't get spread out throughout the earth. Let's keep everyone right here where I can keep an eye on them. I can govern them. We can have this religious system to keep them all, you know, if you have a central shrine, everyone has to worship there. They can't live very far away. So that's what the Tower of Babel was supposed to be for. And God says, let's put an end to this. And so God confused their languages so they couldn't continue to cooperate on the project, and the tower project ended. Now, after that, and the end of chapter 11 tells us the lineage of Abraham. Starts with Shem, one of Noah's sons, and it goes 10 generations up through Terah, who was Abram's father, to Abraham. And then Abram had no children initially, but he married a half-sister named Sarai. And when Abram was in Ur of the Chaldees, which is ancient Babylon, that's where he lived. He was a Babylonian. He was not a Jew. There were no Jews. Abram was no Jew. He was a Babylonian. But God called him to leave his family and to go to a land that God would give him, which was, of course, we call it the land of Israel. In those days it was called the land of Canaan, because the Canaanite tribes, 7 Canaanite city-states occupied and controlled most of it, and the Philistines part of it too. So it was someone else's country, but God says, I'm going to give you that country. You just leave your family and come and go with me. Well, Abram didn't quite obey completely. He took his family with him. He was told to leave them. He did leave his home, but he took his family with him, and they only got about halfway to Canaan. They got to Haran, up in the north of Canaan. And they settled there for years, because apparently Abram's father was a hindrance to him going all the way there. Maybe his father objected. So they stopped in Haran. One of his brothers died there, and his father eventually died there. And when we come to chapter 12, we find that when Abram's father had died, Abraham then removes himself from Haran and goes to the promised land. That's when the story of Abraham and his family begins. So we'll stop there, and we'll go into that story when we come back from a break.